Hi, how you doing? It's Jen from drjenbasir.com. Today I want to talk to you about trauma with the goal of empowering you to know why you're experiencing all these crazy unrelated symptoms that you might be experiencing, that it's not all in your head, and that there's actually something that you can do to deal with these symptoms and to help yourself heal and recover from your trauma. So I'm going to differentiate trauma from stress. Although a lot of the things that you experience with trauma in the long term are also things that people experience who are constantly under stress, especially high levels of stress. So if you have not experienced trauma, but you've experienced stress or a lot of stress, then keep listening because this can apply to you as well. So trauma comes about when we have an event that conjures up feelings of fear, terror, panic, helplessness, and those feelings are accompanied by a change in our body's system. And that change essentially gets us all ramped up and prepares us to take action to protect ourselves and possibly save our life. And so we become traumatized when we get into this state where everything is all ramped up, but yet we don't dissipate that energy. We don't fight, we don't run away, or we don't do something else to get rid of that energy. And so what happens is that energy stays inside of our body and we constantly feel like we're under threat. And so now we have this chronic state of kind of re-experiencing the traumatic experience over and over and over. And so ultimately, the way to heal from the trauma is to dissipate that energy from your body. So it's not something that's just in your head, it's something that's actually contained within your body because your body is doing its normal thing to try to protect you and save you and keep you alive. So to understand what's happening within your body, we're going to talk about the two main systems of your autonomic nervous system. We're going to go into some biology and some science. The autonomic nervous system contains or has two branches, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And these two things automatically regulate the majority of what happens in the background within your body so that you can survive without having to pay attention to it, so that you can breathe, so that you can have normal digestion of your food. All of these processes happen without you having to give them any conscious attention. Thank goodness. So the sympathetic nervous system is the one that gets activated in high levels of stress or in trauma, and it's called the fight or flight system most commonly. There's also another part of that response that's called the freezing, and we'll talk about that as well. And then the parasympathetic nervous system is referred to as the rest and digest part. And so these two systems, your sympathetic and your parasympathetic, are like two parts of this scale or this balance. They work in concert with one another, and you have fluctuations as you go about your day with the level of activity in these two systems. And ideally, what you want is for your parasympathetic system to be the one that is predominant, which means everything is going smoothly. You feel peaceful, you feel happy, you feel calm. Your digestion works really well, and so you don't have any problems with your stomach or your gut or with your memory or with processing your emotions. You're just happy in your experience of being alive. It's easy for you to do your work and to interact with your friends and to have healthy relationships. That's the parasympathetic nervous system. And if right now, if you're thinking, oh my gosh, that sounds wonderful, well, then you probably need a little work to clear out some of the hormones and emotions and things that are keeping you in that fight or flight. So when you experience a traumatic event, what happens is your sympathetic nervous system kicks into high gear. This happens automatically, so you don't have to think about it. And so one of the things that gets shut off is initially is your higher level thinking and processing. And this is good because if you stop to think and weigh all your options, it would be too late. So this happens immediately. And what happens is, think about the fight or flight, the wording of that. Your body is preparing you to defend yourself. And so what happens to your body is that all of the systems that you do not need, that normally run in the background, are going to be turned off or turned down so they don't work so well. And instead, all of your energy is going to be directed to your heart and to your lungs and to your muscles, because those are the parts that you need most to be able to engage in combat with somebody, or to hightail it and to run away as fast as you can. So let's think about some of the different reactions or responses that happen naturally in your body when the fight or flight system is kicked on. And then what we'll do is we'll talk about how this then leads to all these strange symptoms that you might be experiencing if that fight or flight response is not allowed to process itself. So what happens first? You have your traumatic experience, you're threatened. You go on high alert. You go into a heightened state of arousal, which means that everything is ramped up. So your eyes are going to dilate, your pupils are going to dilate so you can take in more light and process things better. It improves your vision of what you need to see. Your heart is going to start to pound. I'm sure you all have felt that at some point or another anyway. It starts to beat faster and harder to pump more blood through your system, to give you more oxygen to your lungs. And so your lungs are the tissues in your lungs are going to dilate so you can take in more oxygen. Your skeletal muscles are going to get more glucose. So the glucose that you have stored, or if you need more glucose created, that will happen, and the glucose is going to be sent out to your muscles because your muscles need the glucose to go into quick action. So those are the main, and if it's also highly, highly traumatic event, what's going to happen is your bladder and your bowels are going to let go, because you don't need anything stored in there if you're going to try to run either. You want to be as light as possible. So that's also something that you might have experienced. These things are all normal, and your body is doing this to help you. It is not your enemy, it is your friend. And sometimes if you get stuck in this, it can feel like your body is not your friend. So these are all the things that happen to help prepare you for your fight or flight. Now, since that mechanism is turned on and you're in this high state of arousal, everything else from the parasympathetic side gets turned down or turned off. So digestion is either going to slow down or just stop. And the first part of digestion is the saliva production in your mouth. So you might experience now a dry mouth. Your stomach isn't going to work so well, and your intestines aren't going to be taking in your food or moving the food or anything through them, because you don't need to be digesting your food when you're trying to run away or trying to fight somebody. You also, again, may have troubles with your bowel and bladder, especially initially. But the biggest things is almost all of your internal organs in your gut are going to stop doing what they normally do. So you're turning off digestion, and you're getting your heart and your lungs turned on to help you deal with this threat. So on the other side of that, you have your parasympathetic nervous system, the one where you go, everything feels so good. The rest and digest. So when you are no longer under threat and you have processed that threat, now the sympathetic nervous system gets calmed down and the parasympathetic nervous system becomes strengthened, and your muscles can relax. Your heartbeat can return to normal, your heart rate. Your lungs, you don't have to breathe so hard and so heavy anymore. Everything calms down. And now your digestion can start to turn on again and to function. So your organs start moving and things start moving through your system. This is the normal process of what is meant to happen to us when we experience trauma. We get the kicking on of the sympathetic nervous system. Everything gets shunted out to the muscles, to the heart, and to the lungs. And then we deal with the experience. We express all of that energy through our physical actions, and then things come back into balance again. This is what happens to a small degree, much smaller than dealing with high-level trauma, when you do something like go on stage to speak, or perform in some way, or go out to and you're participating in a sporting event, and it's a pretty important one. When you feel nervous and kind of anxious and tense about that, that's your sympathetic nervous system that's ramped up a little bit to prepare you for that event. And then you go on stage and you perform, or you get out on the field and you start playing, and you are dissipating that energy. And so ultimately, things calm down. Might not happen right away, right? But things calm back down, and your parasympathetic nervous system takes over. You go back into rest and digest, and you feel good. You feel good. And that's the normal process of what is meant to happen. But in many, many cases, when we experience trauma, that is not what happens. And so we don't actually process and express all of that energy, and so we stay stuck in fight or flight. And then once we are stuck in that state, all of the normal functioning from the rest and digest is not working properly. So let's think about what are some of the physical symptoms that you might experience if you have trauma that you have not yet processed. Well, your heart rate is going to be increased. Your breathing is probably going to be more shallow. You're going to have tension in your neck and in your shoulders, because when we go into fight or flight, we come up like this, right? We're protecting ourselves. We're preparing for this onslaught of whatever it is that we're going to deal with. So now you have tension in your neck and your shoulders. That chronic tension can give you problems like headaches. It can affect the rest of your spine, so now maybe you have some back pain. That tension can also affect your voice and your throat and your chest, so maybe now your voice doesn't come out as clearly or project as well. You have tightness here, or maybe now it's a little harder for you to breathe because of that tightness. You also are going to have trouble with your digestion. Remember, your sympathetic nervous system slows down or stops your digestion. So if you're not digesting or absorbing your food properly, all sorts of symptoms can come as a consequence of that. You tend to see troubles with skin because you're not clearing things through your large intestine and through your bowels. So another way that your body tries to do that is by releasing things, the toxins, through the skin. You might also notice problems with your bones, with your ligaments, your tendons, your other tissues, your hair, your nails, because they're not getting the nutrients that they need. If you're stuck with this unprocessed trauma and your sympathetic nervous system is activated, you might have troubles with concentration and with memory and with clear thinking, because that part of your brain isn't functioning well when you're in the middle of experiencing trauma. It's not meant to. You are also, when your sympathetic nervous system is activated, your adrenals are functioning. They kick on to high level. You have the release of adrenaline going on in your body. And so now, if you haven't processed your trauma, your adrenals are working overtime. You've got more adrenaline coursing through your system. Ultimately, this makes it harder to lose weight. It also can give you troubles with your thyroid. And if you've had thyroid troubles, you know that your thyroid affects pretty much everything else within your system. It affects your metabolism, it affects your memory and your ability to think clearly. It affects your weight. You can either gain weight or lose weight. It affects whether you feel hot or cold, how well you can sleep at night, fertility, so many things that having problems with your thyroid can have an impact on. When you are in fight or flight and you have all that glucose being shuttled out to your muscles, now you don't need it, but you still have all that extra glucose. Ultimately, over time, that can lead potentially to the development of diabetes. You can also have difficulty with metabolism, and especially fat metabolism. So there are a huge amount of things that you can deal with on a day-to-day basis just because you have not processed this trauma, or you're dealing with continually high levels of stress. One other thing that's kind of interesting from our standpoint of our relationships, two things actually with this. If you're in high levels of stress, you're not feeling relaxed and at ease, so you generally don't want to have those nice relationships with people, you're more likely to stay away from them and feel less comfortable around them. Now, your sympathetic nervous system is the one that kicks itself up a little bit to help you sexually to have orgasm. So that sounds like a good thing, but it's the parasympathetic nervous system that helps humans reach the levels of arousal prior to the orgasm. So, especially for men, you might have difficulty getting or maintaining an erection if you're constantly in this high level of fight or flight. So this is important. All of these things are important to understand because now you can look at the symptoms that you're experiencing in your physical body and you can say, oh, okay, I am not crazy. These things potentially are all related because they're all part of this autonomic nervous system and they all get turned on and off together, and this is why all of these seemingly strange symptoms are present. Now, there's one other thing that I think is also really important to understand, and these things, what happens to our body is not just the physical symptoms, but who we are, our emotional state of being, our mental state of being, and how we relate to ourselves, to others, and to the world is also going to change, and sometimes very dramatically in response to the trauma. Now, in many cases, there is a difference between those who experience an acute, one-time traumatic experience, such as a single act of violence, or getting into a car accident, or surgery. And surgery, by the way, is very traumatic for the body, even when you're not aware of it. And then you have the different emotional responses for people who are chronically traumatized or have experienced very high levels of trauma. So if you grew up in a home where you were abused on an ongoing basis, that's going to be different than it will, your experience of how you embody that trauma is going to be different than someone who has a one-time car accident. So if you are in the fight or flight mode and you have not experienced as much chronic trauma or highly traumatic events, you're more likely to be in fight or flight. And I think most people can relate to this because most people are just stressed and overstressed. And while stress and trauma are not the same, they can feel somewhat similar. So if you're in fight or flight, emotionally, you are going to be ready to either attack or defend yourself all the time. So you're going to be more likely in your encounters with other people to be irritable, to be angry, to be defensive, to be combative, because that's what you're prepared for. And so that's more naturally going to come out from you. You also are more likely to experience flashbacks of your traumatic event. And the flashbacks can re-trigger the experience and get all of those hormones and things coursing through your body again. And this is one of the reasons why it's so critical to process and learn how to find healing from the trauma, because it's contained within the memory of your body. And so you don't have to experience the event in real time to actually trigger the fight or flight response within your system. It can happen from a memory. And in that case, you just end up being re-traumatized. So we need to learn how to process it and express it in a safe environment so we're not continually being re-traumatized and going through this cycle of making things worse. So now if you have been chronically traumatized or highly traumatized, you are more likely, generally speaking, to experience the freeze response. The freeze response comes in with after the fight or flight. If you can't fight or flight and there's nothing else that you can do, the freeze response is a protective mechanism where we shut down as much as possible and we dissociate from the event. And the reason that we dissociate is because then we don't physically suffer so much from whatever experience is happening to our bodies. But as you can see then, the problem becomes if you are chronically in this state, this becomes your natural and habitual way of being in the world. you tend to become more dissociated. You want to be alone. You don't want to interact with people. You might not be able to feel things because it's been turned off for so long. You become more passive and more withdrawn and more likely to be depressed instead of your fight or flight people who are more likely to be anxious. So anxiety and depression can both be different responses to unprocessed traumatic experiences. So you have the physical symptoms that you can experience from not processing your trauma, which are related, even though they may seem completely unrelated. And then you have this emotional, mental kind of way of being that you interact with the world after experiencing the traumatic events. We will talk in the next few videos about different ways to heal from this trauma. But this is very similar to the experience of having trapped emotions. When I work with people that have trapped emotions from my energy healing, and I've worked with those that have experienced traumatic childhood, continual ongoing trauma in childhood, and those that have experienced the just acute types of trauma. But in both cases, you get these trapped energies within the body. And so they need to be released. And so the energy healing work is one way to do that. The body also naturally has innate mechanisms of shaking or trembling to release those energies as well. But it needs to be done in an environment where you feel safe to allow those things to happen and not suppressing or turning those things back off again, because otherwise you just perpetuate the cycle of the trauma. So I hope, as always, that this has been helpful for you. And my goal here is to empower you to understand how your body works in response to trauma, and also to some degrees in response to stress, so that you can understand that there is something that you can do, that it's not just in your head, and that you're not crazy, but your body has also embodied, literally, and carries these emotions and these hormones and these experiences within it. And there are ways that you can release and heal from these things. And that's what we'll talk about next time. As always, thanks so much for listening. Please share this with anyone else who you think may benefit as well. And have a fantastic day.